Hello and welcome back to episode 3 of Beginner Basics, the series that aims to provide tips, tricks and guidelines for new and aspiring new players to follow that otherwise would take weeks, if not months of play to learn. When starting a new competitive game, everyone can use a helping hand, and that is what this series is here for. The first episode covered operator roles, the second did breaching and reinforcing, and this third episode shall be focused on information and the gathering of. Information in Siege is critically important. If you have more information than your opponent, then you have the innate advantage of knowing where you need to go, where you can safely go, where to use active gadgets, where to place your crosshair, what angle to hold, and the list truly does go on. Now, this is an extremely broad topic in Siege, and so this video will roughly be divided into 3 sections. The first covering information gathered from drones and cameras, the second covering info gathered from operator gadgets, and the third covering info gathered from less reliable sources such as from team callouts or game audio. So without further ado, let's start with drones and cameras. These are the default methods of gathering information available to both offense and defense, and given that they're available to use at the start of every round, they are likely the methods that new players will be using the most. Or to probably be more accurate, the methods that new players should use the most. So we've already established that knowing more information about the enemy team is extremely advantageous, but what can we learn specifically from each map's default defensive cameras? The most basic thing you can learn from them is where members of the enemy team are spawning. This is valuable in casual multiplayer, where the enemy team all spawn at one location, and in ranked multiplayer as well, where certain operators, depending on their plan of attack and gadget, might spawn in different locations. By knowing where people are spawning, you can potentially set up an ambush as a roamer or adjust your positioning as an anchor. Another thing you can learn from cameras, assuming of course that the attackers don't shoot them all down, is something as simple as what operators they are playing as. If you are new, you might struggle to visually identify one operator from another, but the more you play, the more you'll be able to see an operator on a camera and instantly be able to identify them as, say, a Blitz or Montaigne, to give 2 fairly easy examples, given that they look quite unique with their different shields. Already, by simply spending a few seconds looking through your defensive cameras, you know where the other team is coming from, what operators they are playing, and therefore what gadgets you will need to watch out for and play around. This much information can definitely make or break a round, so be sure to take a quick moment at the start of each defensive round to flick through your cameras, and in quiet moments during the later portions of a match, checking inside cameras for enemy locations can sometimes prove invaluable. Moving on to drones for the attackers, they, at their basic level, serve similar functions as the defender cameras. They allow you to see what the defenders are playing in terms of operators, where they are moving, where certain gadgets are being placed, and, in short, what their defensive setup is. Similar to the defenders, this information lets you adjust your own playstyle and strategy. Maybe you notice that they have a Capcan, Legion and Frost, in which case you will really want to be keeping an eye out for all of those pesky traps. Drones, however, are much more important for the attackers than defending cameras are for the defenders. This is because, ultimately, the defenders need to defend one location, or I guess in bomb 2 locations, but the point still stands, and they can potentially scatter across the entire inside area of the map. This is a lot of surface area to check, as you don't want to run around blindly using your vulnerable face to check for pesky roamers. This is where your drones come in, as they are an expendable, if extremely valuable, resource for gathering information with. If you want to breach a barricaded door and enter the building, a good reflex to get into is to always scout ahead first with your drone. This may seem tedious, but in a round where you have 1 life, you don't want to be taking chances, and I believe that most people find that being alive in Siege is a lot more fun than being dead. So if it's a door, send your drone underneath it, and if it's a window, melee a quick hole in it and jump your drone through to check that it's all clear for your entry. But as mentioned, defenders often scatter to the hills when roaming. Therefore, throughout the course of your round as an attacker, do try to use your drone when safe to check for any roamers that might be nearby or around the next corner. Moving on to the second method of gathering information in Siege, we will now look at operator gadgets that let us do this. The example that you're probably expecting for this section if you have gotten into Siege for a few games is probably Valkyrie, as her 3 black eye cameras provide her team with a lot of extra vision, and more importantly are placed in much less visible locations than the standard beginner defender cameras. But whilst Valkyrie might be the most obvious information-based operator, she is by no means the only one. Other operators on both offense and defense can provide information similar to what her cameras do, such as Echo with his mobile yokai drone, Pulse with his short-ranged heartbeat scan, Lion with his global scan, Jackal with his footprint scan, and even Glaz with his heat vision scope. There is, of course, also IQ, who specializes in gadgets with her electronic scanner, which is valuable information in and of itself, but who can also detect a vigil when his gadget is active, or indeed a pulse when his gadget is active. I would also give a quick shout out to Montaigne, who, as a result of being extremely hard to kill with his shield up, is largely useful when treated as a heavily fortified drone. When safe to, he can enter a site and just stand in a doorway giving callouts to his team as to where gadgets are placed, where defenders are located, what angles are being covered. The list, again, does go on. As can be shown here, there are many different types of information and many ways to gather it. At the most basic level, simply peeking your head around a corner can get some information. Is a hallway clear? Has a window been broken? However, to move on to our final section, there are less obvious ways of getting information, the most reliable of which for a new player is audio. In Siege, player movement makes noise, as does, as you might expect, gunfire, but also when certain gadgets are placed, reinforcements and barricades used, and of course when barricades and soft walls are broken. All of this can provide someone with a lot of extra information. Do you hear a drilling sound? Well, they probably have a capcan then. Do you hear an electronic crackling? Well, to me that screams mute. Hear a heavy metallic scraping sound? Watch out, a Monty is likely heading your way. This type of operator-specific audio is useful primarily in identifying who you're up against operator-wise, as it means that often you don't even need to see an operator with your drone or camera to be able to determine who they are. But during a round when you're not on a drone or camera, the most critical information you can get from game audio is footsteps. If you didn't know, Siege has 4 movement states. You can sprint, which makes a lot of noise, you can walk, which makes less, crouch move, which makes less again, and then you can slow walk, which I advise you to use when unnoticed, as this makes by far the least amount of noise. Also in Siege, the more armor an operator has, the bigger they are, and the more noise they make when moving, which when you think about it is quite logical. This is definitely something also worth bearing in mind. So, simply by moving slower yourself, you will both decrease the likelihood of being heard, whilst also increase the chance that you hear someone else's movement. This use of audio is how a lot of the time you get noticed and hunted down, leaving you wondering how the hell they knew you were where you were. But moving away from audio, let's talk about callouts. Callouts are when a teammate tells his or her team some piece of information. Maybe they died upstairs, and after dying tells the team who killed them and where. Even with this simple callout, which is at its basis just a reaction to dying, the information it provides the team is massive. It can tell roamers where they need to go to get a kill, where the other team might be preparing to push, and again what operators and gadgets the team needs to play around. As a new player, you might not have the confidence to open your mic when this happens and say who killed you, and equally as valid, you might not know what the location of your death was called. I really wouldn't worry too much about this to begin with, as you've got bigger things to focus on, such as what operators do and the layout of the maps, but I would recommend do listen to callouts when they are made, make an effort to learn the maps, and eventually, sometime down the road, you will realise that you know enough to give your team a lot of useful information at varying points in a match. I've roughly labelled in my notes this last section as being unreliable information. As mentioned, there are ways you can reduce the amount of noise you make, and for certain, players do try and do this. And of course, you can't always rely on teammates giving callouts, and if they do call out, they might not be exactly helpful callouts. But when you combine this unreliable information with information you get from you or your team's gadgets, in addition to good droning and camera usage, you can definitely set yourself up for an easier round than you otherwise would have. Information in Siege is critical to winning, and it's up to you to both gather and then use it. With that said, that's this episode done. We've covered how to gather information using drones, cameras, operator gadgets, callouts, and audio, and how damn important it is to do so. Coming up in the next episode of Beginner Basics, I'll be covering destruction in Siege, which, as you might expect, should be pretty fun. Feel free to leave a like or even sub if you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to hit that notification bell if you do to receive notifications in future, and I'll see you guys in the next Beginner Basics.